You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Okay, well, welcome back to the Deer University podcast. I'm Bronson Strickland, and I'm joined by Steve Damaris. You want to say hello, Steve? There he is. And we are lucky enough to have my buddy and colleague, Mick Hellickson, is joining us again. And Mick, of course, here in a second, I want to let you take the opportunity to catch everyone up on where you've been and what you've been doing and so forth. But I do want to take this moment to let everyone know that I kind of began my deer biology and management career with Mick. And something that Mick has never told me, I don't think, but it's generally implied, is I'm probably the single biggest reason for your success.
Yeah.
So Mick was just starting a PhD program, and he really needed some heavy lifting to help him get that program off the ground. And I volunteered as a technician for 6 months to work with Mick, and just really, I like to think I'm responsible for what we have today. This enterprise of Mick Hellickson. I'm probably the reason for that, but. Mick, why don't you give everybody just a quick snapshot of where you've been and what you're doing now?
Good morning, Steve and Bronson. Good to see you guys. I'm originally from northern Iowa, grew up in Humboldt, one county south of the Minnesota state line, with the passion for being outdoors, hunting, fishing, trapping, hunting, trapping. That was about all I did, those three things. But went to Iowa State for my undergrad degree in fisheries and wildlife biology. And before high school, my biggest interests were with upland game, with pheasants and that sort of thing. And then I picked up a bow and arrow and started bow hunting, and learned how smart whitetails can be and how challenging it is to harvest a buck of any age with a bow and arrow. And that intrigued me so much that I changed from being an upland game kind of guy to being a deer guy. And as I was wrapping up my undergrad at Iowa State, I started applying to graduate schools and got accepted at Cornell with a study with pen deer, measuring digestible energy. It was a pen deer study. I wasn't that interested. I also accepted at Texas A&I in Kingsville. Study that involved trapping coyotes and measuring post-rut mature buck survival, helicopter drive net captures, and man, that sounded a lot more fun. So I packed up and moved to Kingsville, Texas in '88, and got a master's degree in range and wildlife management, and working with Charlie DeYoung and Sam Beeson. And Charlie's relationship with Larry Marchington opened the doors for me to pursue a PhD at the University of Georgia before finishing my master's at Kingsville. And so that's what I did. Never would have gone the PhD route if it weren't for the particular study that Bronson came and helped me with. But it involved radio tracking the movements of 125 different age bucks that we had radio collared over a 3-year period in South Texas. So after getting my PhD, I worked at the Cesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute for a year, and then at the King Ranch as the chief biologist for 12 years. And then in 2010, went off on my own, and I've been consulting privately since 2010. That was kind of long, guys. Sorry about that.
No, man, that's good. It tells people where you've been. So where we really want to go today, topic-wise, Mick, is I think you have a very unique background in that you have worked very extensively in two areas that we would call big buck, hot spots. You've got all your experience of where you grew up and where today you continue to hunt and manage deer in the Midwest and Iowa, and then also with your business and where you were educated down in South Texas. And so, I know Steve also, worked in Texas and has that, that interdisciplinary of working there and then working in the Southeast, et cetera. And so what we kind of wanted to compare was, what are the dynamics of deer herds in South Texas and the Midwest, things that you have to do similarly or maybe differently to manage for older age bucks, mature bucks, and big bucks in terms of antler size. So maybe why don't we start there, Mick? What with all your experience, and especially now you go to so many different properties, what are some things that keys to success? What are people on those ranches doing right? And it looks like Steve has a note.
Before we get into what people are doing with the population management, Mick, could you kind of explain kind of the landscape characteristics between the Midwest and the South Texas? Because those are pretty starkly different. And those are kind of the context for maybe the differences in deer management that you'll mention.
Yeah, in Iowa, I guess before I left Iowa in my college years, we started hunting southern Iowa. So we would drive from our home in northern Iowa for the 5-day shotgun season and hunt southern Iowa. And it was that change in hunting up in Iowa that started what ended up my brother and I together buying a farm in southern Iowa and then leasing neighboring farms. And so the biggest, one of the biggest differences between Iowa and South Texas is South Texas, under the MLD program, you have a 5-month-long rifle season. 5 months. You can hunt deer. You can hunt bucks with a rifle from October 1st through the end of February. So any buck that hits your radar screen, you got 5 months to hunt him. You're going to kill him if you're at all, a good hunter. In Iowa, you got a 5-day gun season, or what happens later is a 9-day gun season. So you have to pick one or the other, but you have 5 days or 9 days. That's your season. And so that's one major difference. Another big difference between Iowa and Texas, they're both almost entirely privately owned. Very similar in that respect. 97% privately owned in Texas, 95, 96% privately owned in Iowa. There's not any public land in either state to speak of. But the size of the privately owned tracts are a lot different. In Iowa, the average farm size is probably 200 or 300 acres. In South Texas, the area south of San Antonio, the average ranch size is probably somewhere around 1,000 acres. So, and then another big difference is most privately held properties in South Texas that are managed for trophy deer hunting are high fenced, most of them, the majority. In Iowa, it's very rare to come across high fence. There's probably only 8 or 10 high fence properties in the whole state of Iowa. So it's almost unheard of to have high fence in Iowa. Very common for high fence in South Texas.
So now let's talk about the landscape. What's so different about the ecology of those landscapes?
Huge differences are nutrition related. In Iowa, they're the number 1 corn producer in the country, number 2 soybean producer in the country. And so corn and soybeans across the landscape, 75, 80% of the actual acres, landscape acres in Iowa are row cropped, farmed, and soybeans or corn on a rotational basis. And then the next most common crop is alfalfa up there for hay, and for cattle pastures. And so you got corn, alfalfa, and soybeans across the landscape. So nutrition is through the roof in Iowa. And that's probably the number 1 reason why the Midwest is the number 1 producer of Boone and Crockett's. South Texas, there's not any row crop farming. And so nutrition is at the opposite end of the spectrum in South Texas. There's a baseline of browse that's available across the landscape, so the deer are never starving, but they're not at all at the nutritional level that deer in the Midwest are. And then The landscape in Iowa is a lot different because of the rich soil. It's almost all cleared, and almost all the ponds, natural lakes, and have been drained, and so the landscape's almost all farmed. There's very little cover. The southern tier of counties in Iowa, the southern two rows of counties, that escaped the last glacier recession. And so it's a lot more rolling terrain, a lot more hills. And so the topography is not conducive to as high intense farming as the rest of the state is. So the southern third of Iowa, the rolling hills, there's 20, 30, 40% timber that's not farmed. And so the habitat there is a little better than the rest of the state. But in South Texas, 95+% of the landscape's deer habitat. I mean, from San Antonio to Mexico and Corpus Christi to Laredo, it's almost all deer habitat. All of it's in brush.
Pretty big differences in the amount of rainfall, I guess, you get in a year with South Texas and Iowa.
Yeah, good point, Bronson. Rainfall is real dependable in Iowa. I think the average annual rainfall is 35, 40 inches, somewhere in that neighborhood. But it's real consistent, a lot less variable than South Texas. South Texas average rainfall varies from the coast, 25, 26 inches to 15, 16 inches western western South Texas. And so, yeah, plus rainfall is extremely variable in South Texas.
Mick, I want to ask you to clarify something. I've heard a lot of people talking about Midwest and this corn. And I think, in my perspective, people believe that, corn is the cause. But to me, it's the soil quality and the other crops that you mentioned, the alfalfa and the soybeans, that provide the forage quality that they can eat during the summer, and then the quality of the soils that is why the corn is planted. How much corn is actually eaten as a forage by the deer while they're growing antlers? And then is there any actual corn kernels eaten as a byproduct of the harvest?
Yeah, good point, Steve. Corn is only eaten by deer in Iowa after the kernels harden, and the cob turns, the kernels turn hard, and so corn's only eaten by Iowa deer from October, and then waste corn on the ground that's left over after harvest, they're eating that until the fields are replowed again in the spring, or replanted in the spring. Soybeans and alfalfa are critical for their protein content, for antler growth in the late winter through summer. Deer aren't eating corn at all then during that antler growing stage. But I would add that corn, I think, is one of the big reasons there's Boone and Crockett's in Iowa too, in addition to the springtime soybeans, because the corn is extremely high in energy, starch, energy. That's probably as important as protein content is for deer production and survival. And I think it's critical in the winter, late winter, for deer to have that access to that corn that's there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Nick, I guess what and you kind of was, I think, talking about the continuum of northern Iowa and southern Iowa. A lot of times I picture in some of those places where the landscape itself is agriculture sprinkled with a little bit of deer habitat here and there. And of course that's a continuum to where you're at, but some of these places where we see, at a county scale, like if you're looking at Boone and Crockett records, it's never just a county that's 90% agriculture. It's typically going to be this kind of mix of 50-50, 60-40, et cetera, to where you have enough deer habitat, you have enough cover to grow a deer population at a big scale. And then you also have this abundance of agriculture that the deer population can never overwhelm. Like in the South, we can overwhelm our food plots because the ratio of forest habitat relative to food plots can be out of whack. First of all, I guess, do you agree with that assessment?
I agree. And that brings up a point that I missed earlier, Bronson. Another huge difference between Iowa and South Texas is buck age structure. In South Texas, with the land holding sizes so large and a lot of those properties being high fenced, upwards of 20-30% of the buck population is fully mature, 5+ years old. That's unheard of anywhere else in the whitetail world. You don't find that anywhere else. In the Midwest, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when I grew up deer hunting in the Midwest, 70-80% of the buck harvest, 90% of the buck harvest is made up of yearling bucks. And still in a large percentage of Iowa that's intensively row crop farmed, and the deer habitat's restricted to the river bottoms that make up 5-10% of a county, bucks are still hunted to where 70-90% are yearling bucks. And the deer population is locally extinct in some areas because of that, and the DNR has to be real careful about how many doe tags they allot to that part of Iowa. Now, the southern third of Iowa, there's some cover for deer to get away from hunters, and a lot more of the landscape is deer cover. And so there, the buck age structure is a lot better just because of the cover. And now because of people practicing management in southern Iowa, deer management in southern Iowa, where they're passing up young bucks, 1 and 2 year old bucks, there's a lot higher percentage of the buck segments that's mature in southern Iowa, but it still doesn't approach South Texas, not even close.
So I've got a question for you about cover in the Midwest, and let's use your example in Iowa. Are you ever intentionally managing for cover, or is cover just by default, meaning that if we're not in agriculture, then succession is going to happen? A forest is eventually going to appear a decade or 2 or 3 down the road. Are you having to go in there and augment the habitat to develop cover, or is it just happening naturally?
In Iowa, slopes are where you find cover, areas that aren't flat enough to farm. And so the higher percentage of a county that's sloped, the higher percentage of deer cover there is available. Now, in our particular case, we've planted over 45,000 trees in the last 20 years to add to the cover that exists there and to put the cover where we want the cover. And then we've also, on our personal property that we own, we've taken out all row crop production and converted it all to CRP set aside, where we've got tall grass prairie now. And so that's additional cover that we've added because that's the limiting factor. And so we have taken steps to make sure there's more cover there. But for the most part, when you're talking about trees that are 20 to 100 years old, the cover has to be there ahead of time. And in Iowa, the only cover that's there is the river bottoms and the sloped areas,
So can we generalize here, Mick, in our comparing and contrasting? And it'll be a little more detailed than this, but I guess when I think about it, to me in Iowa, in that situation, what is limiting is going to be buck age structure. And that's just having land holdings large enough, cooperatives of people that are protecting those bucks to get them up to, 4 years of age or greater. And in South Texas, you kind of by default have these larger land holdings. You have cover to some extent. It may not be the best cover, but you have cover, like you mentioned. The limiting factor there can sometimes be, and to some degree always is going to be, growing a deer population in terms of fawn recruitment, dealing with those spring and summers where you have drought and very little fawn recruitment, sometimes almost non-existent, less than 10%, less than 5% some years. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah. Fawn crops they're not a worry in Iowa, year in, year out. And you really don't, first of all, you don't have to manage the landscape for nutrition at all in Iowa. In South Texas, that's your number one priority you have to worry about is managing nutrition. And the fawn crops, I've flown ranches without counting a fawn in a fall survey, a 0% fawn crop, And so in Iowa, they're, up 70% of yearling doe fawns in Iowa, 70% are having fawns themselves when they're yearlings, they're dropping fawns. That's unheard of in South Texas. The average annual fawn crop in South Texas is 30%. So it takes around 3 does to raise a fawn in South Texas. In Iowa, one doe on average raises 1 to 1.5 fawns per doe in Iowa. So it's huge difference there.
So that productivity difference, Mick, between the consistently productive habitats in Iowa versus the highly variable productivity in South Texas drives one big portion of your harvest variation between the two regions. And could you kind of describe the doe harvest side of things in Iowa versus South Texas?
Yeah, I work with about 60 landowners in South Texas that own about 70 ranches. And it's rare for me to recommend a significant doe harvest at all on those 70 ranches in any given year. If we have good rainfall years, spring and summer rainfall years back to back to back, when that happens, which almost never happens, then I'll recommend, a significant doe harvest. But for the most part, we don't even shoot does in South Texas. We don't have to. It takes 3 to raise a fawn on average. And a ranch that's supplementally fed, it's about a 60 or 70% fawn crop instead of about a 30% fawn crop. So it's still taking 1.5 to 2 does to raise a fawn, even under good nutrition. In Iowa, the production's through the roof. It's the best it is anywhere in the whitetails range. And so if you were to have a high fence in Iowa, you'd probably have to spend shoot most of your shells at does to limit the population, to control the population. Now, Iowa's almost entirely free range, low fence, and our properties in southern Iowa are low fenced. And we have neighbors that shoot the heck out of deer of all sizes and sexes, and so they really help us achieve the doe harvest we need. Without our neighbors, we would have to kill a lot more does than we typically do in our situation. But yeah, doe harvest is huge in Iowa. It's very critical that you keep the deer population below the carrying capacity, the cultural carrying capacity.
Would you say, Mick, let's say you had a really good, whether it be a camera survey or a population estimate, so would Iowa sustain easily a 30% doe harvest?
I think so, yes, because the fawns are even having fawns.
Fawns are having fawns, right?
Right, and so yes, I mean you can get by with a lot lower doe population in Iowa than you can in South Texas.
And in South Texas, it may be if you recommended on one of those ranches to have a doe harvest, it may be less than 10%.
Absolutely,
yeah. So it's just that difference in the production, like Steve said, of those environments. You have one that's conducive to having fawns and those fawns living, and then you have an environment where it's just very difficult to make it for a fawn to live to 1 year of age, be recruited into the population. Really big difference there.
So Claire, point of clarification, just in case some of our audience doesn't understand, when you talk about a 30% harvest rate or a 10% harvest rate, we're saying, if you have 100 does on your property, a 30% rate is remove 30 does every year. A 10% harvest rate would be remove 10 of those 100 does every year.
Yeah, not the entire population, but of the does. Yeah, 10% or less, or 30%. Well, Mick, let's talk about and Steve, I'm kind of jumping in here with a lot of topics, so you have some comments, feel free to jump in as well. But one thing I wanted to cover with Mick, this was many of the campfire discussions we had so long ago. It was like 5 years ago, Mick.
Yeah, add a zero to that, pretty close.
Boone and Crockett score, or let's just say antler size. In South Texas gets a lot of attention, and deservedly so, for the number of big bucks. But can you help people with kind of scaling that with the amount of land that's required, and kind of the Boone and Crockett buck is not the norm, and that's something Steve and I have tried to talk about a lot on the podcast. A Boone and Crockett is not the norm on a South Texas ranch. It's more of an anomaly. It's the rare instance. And then even in Iowa, those yearling bucks, they're not born a Boone and Crockett. So we're still dealing with, a distribution of scores, and the rare exceptions turn out to, score 170 or greater. Can you kind of compare what you think? And I don't know if we really have a good data set to have an apples and apples comparison of, random deer captures in South Texas, which there's plenty of data for that. I don't know if we have a comparative data set from Iowa or the Midwest, but in your experience, what's the average Boone and Crockett score of a mature buck in Iowa or in the neck of the woods you hunt and manage?
It's a lot bigger than South Texas, like you're alluding to. The bell curve of distribution and antler scores for South Texas, the average for a mature buck that's 5+ years old, and we're limiting the data set to only bucks that are 5+. The average gross Boone and Crockett score in South Texas is 130 inches, give or take 3 or 4 inches. It's 130 inches is what every buck wants to be in South Texas that's mature, right? And then less than 5% of mature bucks gross score above 160 in South Texas. Less than 5% of mature bucks gross score above 160. In Iowa, that bell curve distribution's the same. It's just shifted way to the right on that scale. The average gross Boone and Crockett score for a mature buck in Iowa that's 5+ years old, and we don't have the data there that we have in South Texas with the random buck captures that you talked about. There's never been one of those done in Iowa, and so all we have in Iowa are trail camera photos to estimate gross scores and to estimate ages, and then we have harvest data with a guess of the age of the deer for the most part, but a more accurate guess than South Texas. And there, I would guess that it's about 145-inch average for a mature buck in Iowa, somewhere between 145 and 150 would be the average gross Boone and Crockett score for an Iowa buck that's 5+.
Yeah, that's just amazing. And I know when Steve and I are giving seminars and talking about this topic one way, and it may not be the most effective way to kind of demonstrate the concept, but I seem to get feedback from the audience of kind of how they understand it. But it's the equivalent for the example you gave, Mick, of in South Texas, where you're talking about, you end up with just maybe 1% are going to score over 170. That's the equivalent of, you having a day or a season or whatever, and 100 mature bucks walk past you, and only one of those. So that's a really key, very important thing to mention there. We're not saying that it's 1% of all the bucks on the landscape or on your property. We're saying it's 1% of the mature bucks. And so by default, and this is something Steve and I emphasize a lot as well, but you have to recognize, if you're in an environment where bucks are being hunted heavily, like in the Southeast, you have got to recognize, starting at 2 or 3 years of age, is the buck that you anticipate or predict is going to be that 150 or 160 or 170. And you got to do everything you can to protect him so that he can get to be 4, 5, 6 years of age, because those bucks are so rare. You got to sell out to protect that handful of bucks and make sure they get older if you're going to have success in one of these more heavily hunted environments. It sounds like you have a lot more, well, you do. You have a lot more flexibility. So, Mick, you may not have to let 100 mature bucks walk past you in Iowa. You maybe only have to have 50, 40 or 50 walk past you. But you certainly are producing per unit of area, in terms of the area that you're hunting, you're going to produce more of these 150s, 160s, and 170s. And then you don't have to produce as many mature bucks before you're going to get a 150. It kind of works both ways.
Yeah, great point, Bronson. And it brought up something else too, that's strikingly different between South Texas and Iowa. South Texas, I mentioned it already. You have a 5-month long rifle season. You can also bait in Texas. You can hunt from a moving vehicle in Texas, you know, with a scoped rifle, and you got a 5-month season. My landowners that I work with, if we identify a shooter buck that's, you know, 5+ years old, above 170, that's on the property, and if they hunt it, they kill it. I mean, if we grow the buck, they kill it, and it goes to the harvest, and it counts toward the harvest, you know, for that ranch. In Iowa, I've got hundreds and hundreds of photos, trail camera photos of giant bucks that we've never killed up there. Just because we grow a big buck in Iowa doesn't mean we get to kill it. In fact, it's rare that we kill it. You know, they're just hard to hunt in Iowa with the 5-day gun season or a 9-day, and you're not allowed to use bait. You can't use a rifle. It's shotgun or muzzleloader only. And they just recently added rifle hunting with smooth wall cartridges. You know, that's legal now in Iowa, but you still can't hunt with a high-powered rifle. And so we grow lots of big deer in Iowa that we never kill. All the big deer we grow in South Texas, it's at the landowner's discretion, but if they choose to harvest it, they get out there and they get it killed. I mean, it dies and it counts, you know.
Mick, you mentioned a key population management factor in Iowa. You said your goal is to try to get bucks to live longer. In South Texas, it's kind of a golden rule is the harvest rate on bucks is, you know, well, heck, you don't shoot a buck until it's 7 or 8 years of age on many properties, unless they're removed as a cull buck or a management buck to kind of make room in the buck segment. But in Iowa, you're free range, and you mentioned neighbors shooting a lot of both sexes and all ages. What do you do to effectively conserve age structure in your population, in your management program?
Well, I can only control, and controls in quotes, the hunters we have on our own properties up there. And for those hunters, you know, we do a very intensive preseason trail camera survey where we identify all of the eligible bucks for harvest based on my guesstimates of growth score and age on the hoof. And so before the season, I provide a shoot, don't shoot PowerPoint slideshow for our hunters. And I identify the bucks that are age eligible or antler size eligible for harvest. And so that helps them a lot with, you know, which bucks to shoot, which ones not to shoot. And mistakes still happen and yada, yada, yada. But for all of our neighbors around us, we don't have any control over what they kill. Now, we've been lucky over the last 30 years that our neighbors have heard of our success, and over time, they've started passing up young bucks themselves, to our credit. And that helps the whole population around us, you know, to age up. And so that's helped. It's made a big difference over the last 3 decades, you know, comparing our harvest last season to harvest 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's a lot different because of our neighbors. But, you know, in Iowa, the hard thing is to get a buck to maturity. Even getting them to 3 is tough. And by 3 in Iowa, bucks are usually a pretty big buck. It's a hard buck for any hunter to pass up, you know. But antler size doesn't peak in Iowa at 3. That buck's going to get bigger if you just have a little harvest restraint and don't squeeze the trigger. But again, that's hard to do in a 5-day season too. That's not conducive to passing up bucks when you only have 5 days. You know, you don't want to pass up a thing. You got 5 days. So
you have a population control relative to education of your hunters. You mentioned habitat management that you've been doing to improve cover. Does that help keep deer on your property during the hunting season?
Absolutely. That's made a big difference over the last 20 years on the properties that we own, and that we can manage that intensely. You know, it's made a big difference. We also put areas off limits to ourselves for trespassing in that are sanctuaries that we use to help hold bucks. But probably the single biggest factor that helps us harvest the bigger deer on our farms in Iowa is our food plot program. You know, our cool season food plot program. We have the best food in the neighborhood come the shotgun season, you know, and that's by design. And we've worked really hard at that, you know, and over the last few years, we've done a lot with electric fencing of our food plots, temporary electric fencing that we take down a week before the shotgun season. You know, we have soybeans, acres and acres of standing soybeans in early December in Iowa. because of the electric fences around our food plots. And imagine the attractiveness of that when all of our neighbors have plowed fields, and they don't have that. And we have corn, standing corn, acres and acres and acres of standing corn because of that electric fence that we take down. So that makes a huge difference at keeping the deer we have in our neighborhood on our properties, and then also drawing in deer, especially the late muzzleloader season. We're getting deer that we've never seen before that come from 2, 3, 4 miles away because of, our great winter food plots.
All right, Mick, I have to ask, because we'll be asked, what is, in general, what is your food plot recipe? What are you planting?
Corn and soybeans. Now we do plant a lot of turnips too. Those are really good late season attractants, that work really well in Iowa. So I would say it's those three: it's corn, soybeans, and then turnips or brassicas or the radishes. And we have a lot of Roundup ready alfalfa that we plant too, to provide nutrition. But we're not hunting over those areas during the shotgun season. Now, our members that are bow hunters are actively hunting our alfalfa plots, in October, but they're not attracting deer in December.
So the only cool season forages you're planting are those brassicas.
Yeah, and I misspoke earlier. The corn and soybeans, they're not cool season. They're planted in the spring. They're warm season. But because of our electric fences, we're hunting over those crops in December, in the cool during winter, So
you're protecting them until deer season or right before deer season. Yes. I'm curious, why do you not plant any cereal grains like wheat or oats or things like that? You just haven't seen the need to?
We have in the past, but they're usually dormant or dead, by December. We need a crop that's most attractive to deer during the first 2 weeks of December. Those are the gun season weeks in Iowa. And so we have to manage our whole food plot program toward providing attractive food plots in the first half of December. And winter wheat, oats, when you get several hard freezes back to back to back, those crops play out by the time we're up there, gun hunting.
Just not as cold hardy.
Right.
Yeah. Gotcha.
So to use the old Kevin Costner quote from one of his movies, "If you build it, they will come." You have built
the dreams in Iowa too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, field of yeah. So you have a field of dreams of hunter dreams and buck dreams in December. So you're bringing deer in because there's cover and there's optimum nutrition for that time of year. You've got the leafy soybeans, you've got the soybean pods so they have the beans, which are high protein and energy, and you have the standing hard kernel corn, which is a high energy. So you're providing what they want and need early in the winter.
Absolutely. Yes.
And you have your hunters educated. So if you do happen to draw some, younger, middle-aged, better quality right side of the distribution, we like to talk about, bucks onto your property, your hunters are not going to shoot them, whereas they might have been shot on a neighbor.
Yeah.
That doesn't have that attractive habitat component. So I guess the point I want to make is it's so critical to have what they need physically in terms of structure and nutrition habitat wise, and then apply the effective educational hunter education to protect the buck segment.
Yeah, you're not gonna maximize success without both. You have to have both. Yeah.
Mick, let's real quick, we don't need to get down to 2 decimal places, that level of precision. Let's if you don't mind, maybe think about one of your properties. Maybe I'm talking about Iowa here, and let's talk about on a particular property that do you have one that's say 1,000 acres, or is everything under 1,000 acres?
Yeah, we have it's unique in southern Iowa. There's a few larger property sizes in southern Iowa. In our county where we're hunting, it's Union County, Iowa. I can think of 2 properties in the entire county that are over 1,000 acres. Now, at one time we had both of those properties under lease we had the hunting rights to those properties, but we no longer do on either of those. And so 1,000-acre property is extremely rare in Iowa.
Okay, so similar in the Southeast. In terms of people owning the properties, you might lease properties bigger than that, but for people that own and are managing these 200-acre properties, 300 or 400-acre properties, I wanted to touch on your experience on with it set up like you have described, with managing the cover, having a well-developed cover, adding the food, the high energy food, as well as the protein food, etc. What are your expectations for that size property over time? In other words, could you expect that we're at least going to grow? I'm not going to say you kill them, because you made a good distinction where, you hope you see it, and then you even hope, because you got a 5-day season, that you kill it. But every year on that size property, opportunities for a 150, 160?
Every year, year in, year out.
Every single year.
Yeah. In our program, we're trying on the trophy bucks to get them to 5, and more realistically, we're getting them to 4 before they get harvested for the most part. And then bucks with less than 10 points, we're more liberal. First of all, I'm more liberal in my age estimates of those bucks than I am of bucks with mainframe 10 or more points by design. And so there we're trying to get, the 8 and 9 pointers or less to 3+ years old. That's kind of our overall goal. And once an Iowa buck hits 4 or 5, the average gross score, I think, for that buck is a 145, maybe a 150. So there's a lot of 150s once you start managing in Iowa because of the nutrition and bigger body sizes up there. It's not uncommon. Now in South Texas, a 150 still is real uncommon, Yeah. I missed your question altogether there, Bronson. I'm not sure.
No, I guess I wanted to show people what would be possible on a 500-acre property,
Mm-hmm.
like you have, and I'm trying to convey it, to people in the Southeast, of if you had a 500-acre property and you were able to have the opportunity, to see and harvest a 150 every year, that would just be off the charts success. And from what you're describing, that's more or less normal, given it's that level of management that you are applying.
Yeah, I think you have the harvest opportunity for a 150 class every year. Now, southeastern states have a lot longer hunting seasons than Iowa's 5-day gun season. I looked at this just to provide some guidance to our members, but over the last 27 years hunting our farm and our neighboring leases in southern Iowa, I've only successfully harvested a buck 13 years out of 27. So I only get a buck about every other year. And so I'm not killing a 150 every year. And I don't know, a third of those bucks gross scored under 150 probably. So it's still pretty rare to kill a 150. But I attribute that more to Iowa's short gun season. I mean, gosh, a lot of things got to come together for you to successfully harvest a 150 plus in Iowa's short gun season, even under our situation.
You do have a longer archery season, though. I'm assuming you have several months, but it's just the logistics then of being able to harvest a buck with your bow. Success rate's just a lot lower.
Now, if I were a resident in Iowa and I had access to the bow hunting, which, by Iowa's non-resident draw, you can only successfully draw a bow tag as a non-resident about once every 3 to 4 years, So I've only bow hunted our property twice since I moved to Texas.
Wow.
1988, I've only been able to bow hunt up there twice. Now, I enjoy gun hunting during the shotgun seasons, and so I haven't tried to get a bow tag every year, but yeah, you do have a long bow season in Iowa, but that's just for the residents, and on our properties with the long bow season, I would expect to kill a 150 every year there. If I put the time in, it should happen.
So when you said a moment ago, you were talking about this success rate, and it gets to be gun season, and you're lucky enough to see it. You're even more lucky if you harvest it. So a lot of these bucks that you're getting in that preseason extensive camera survey you're doing, all of those don't show up in the harvest. Are they showing up in your neighbor's harvests that are residents? Or were you also implying that there's a lot of buck mortality once they reach 4 years or greater? We don't know what happened to it. Or is it the neighbors killing them?
Yeah, and we have the data if I go back and look at it, but off the top of my head, I would guess more than half of the mature trophy bucks we identify in the camera survey every year go unharvested by everybody. They don't get killed, and we do a really good job of networking with our neighbors. We send them our harvest pigs, they send us theirs. And so we do a good job of finding out which bucks get harvested. And I would have to guess that less than half of our shooter bucks get killed, and they're just dying from all kinds of things, not old age usually, but car accidents and we've had EHD come through a couple different times since we've been managing the farm there in southern Iowa, that have set us back and our buck age structure, and we also have brain abscess to deal with. My wife found one of our target bucks dead, when we were up there actively shotgun hunting that buck. She found it on a deer drive dead, and it was clear after I looked at the skull, it had died from brain abscess, and then we had just this past hunting season, we had a giant buck we put off limits because his right side antler development had messed up, and so we wanted to give him another year and let that right side grow back normal. We found him dead, and I think he got hit by a car because that whole right pedicle was loose on his skull, And then we had a third buck, a Boone and Crockett, that we harvested because he was acting so silly, but he had brain abscess also, and so we have more things that can, I guess, of natural causes, a much higher natural mortality rate for our bucks in Iowa than happens in South Texas on managed properties.
Now, Mick, that's not fair chase. Being able to harvest up. Being able to that's right.
Our farm manager killed him,
Yeah.
And he literally walked up to the buck and shot him,
My goodness.
It's a funny story. I was in a pit cornfield standing next to the landowner in his pickup truck, and we're talking together, and all of a sudden this buck, and this is 10 or 11 in the morning, broad daylight, and all of a sudden this buck comes walking out, and it comes walking right towards us, and it brushes the front quarter, the headlight area of the landowner's truck as it walks past us, and then it gets around us, and and then it walks into the timber, and we just gotten fresh snow the day before. So after that conversation, I went and got our farm manager, and he tracked that buck into the woods about 100 yards and shot it, and I didn't know why he was acting that way. I knew something was wrong with him, but then when we skinned him, I had a brain abscess.
Wow. That's an amazing story. Okay, Mick, we want to be respectful of your time. I've got one last kind of situation I want to get your response to, and then Steve, I'll let you wrap up if you have anything else you want to ask. So Mick, let's say, let's put on your consulting hat for the moment, and I'm not saying it has to be in oh, you already do have it on.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it has to be right there in southern Iowa, but you go somewhere to the Midwest. In your experience, what is usually the thing you see that people are doing wrong, and what are the steps they can take? Like, what would be your top, 1, 2, 3, landowner or lease group? These are the things you need to do, and I fully expect that in 3 to 4 years they're going to pay big dividends.
To form a QDM cooperative if you can in the Midwest. I mean, it's all about controlling the buck harvest on enough acres to get bucks to the mature age class. And so in Iowa, that's your goal, is to protect enough bucks, young and middle-aged bucks, to get them to maturity. And to do that with small properties, you have to join with your neighbors, form a cooperative if you can, or lease the hunting rights if you can. A lot of Iowans are so opposed to having to pay any money for hunting rights. It's unheard of. I think I was the first guy to offer money to hunt deer in Iowa, back in the mid 90s. Nobody did it then. And it's still rare up there. People don't want to have to pay for access. But if you can, if it's that important to you, go do it. Go talk to your neighbors and see if you can secure the hunting rights around you and add on property size. And that way you can control access. That way you can see some bucks get older. That's the biggest hurdle to jump in the Midwest with the small properties, or just work with your neighbors, tell them these are our goals. These are bucks we put on our don't shoot list, and just share information and knowledge with your neighbors too. Work with them.
Are you ever going to recommend someone? Now, let's assume here you're dealing with a landowner. You're going to advise some of them to take a field out of production. Let's reduce the amount of food. If you're in that agricultural landscape, you're going to tell them to put more cover on the landscape, hold more deer on their property.
If I were consulting for small landowners in Iowa that wanted to manage their own property, yeah, those would be absolute things I would do. I would try to take out the least productive row crop acres and convert them to tall grass prairie. That you plant grass specific plants that are good bedding cover for deer. And then another thing that works good in Iowa too is, and people are going to frown when I say this, but we've planted thousands of cedar trees in Iowa. When we're up there hunting in December, all of the deciduous trees have lost their leaves. All the row crops have been harvested. The landscape is bare. You can see forever, and you need to break up that. And we do that by planting cedars. And then also, one of the worst things you can do in timber in Iowa is graze it. You don't have any understory. You don't have, and it's almost a deer desert in December when we're up there hunting, and so outlining your timber stands with cedars works great, and it makes the winter cover that much better too. So planting cedars and converting your least productive acres to native warm season grasses would be good goals for landowners there.
Do you have burning in your program in those fields?
We burn a lot, and we have to keep our CRP acres re-enrolled, and we enroll them at the highest rate we can from a wildlife standpoint. And so that requires, burning it mid-contract burning once every 5 years, and we're doing it 2 to 3 times every 10-year period. So we do a lot of burning now. That's counterproductive to our cedar planting too. So we have to be real careful. We've burned a lot of cedars that we've planted, and so that's hard, but yeah, burning's good.
Okay. Well, Mick, this has been great. And Bronson, it's so good to see you two old buddies, touching base, and we all share that.
In Bronson still, it's all gray, white, but there's a lot more of it.
Yeah. Mick's turned gray, mine turned loose. Yeah.
But it's great connecting with you, Mick. We go back, all three of us go back along many years to time in Texas, and now we're still learning as professionals and applying our knowledge. And we really appreciate your sharing your knowledge. You've given us and our audience some really clear instructions on what to do in the Midwest to significantly improve their deer population management. And it's difficult to apply all these in success, but you've given them the keys. And we have a pretty strong following in Texas and a moderate following in the Midwest. And so if you're a Midwest listener, I would suggest that you tell your friends about this podcast so that they can learn from Mick as he shares his abundant knowledge and experience for deer management. Mick, thank you so much for your time, and Bronson, thanks for setting this up.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. Always good to see you.
It's you guys. Thank you for inviting me. Very much enjoyed it.
Absolutely. We'll do it again soon. How about that?
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Good to see you as well. Thanks, everyone. We appreciate you tuning in and listening.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.